Good morning to you, wherever you may be in the world today. Alan Clements here from Los Angeles, California, United States of America, April 7th, 2021. Today is a continuation of my talk from yesterday, Indoctrination. It's a favorite topic of mine, as well as freedom. The subtitle of today's talk is The Noble Struggle, the Noble Fight for Freedom. So Indoctrination Part 2, The Noble Struggle for Freedom. I want to start off by saying the beloved homeland of my Dhamma life, Myanmar, Burma, continues to undergo the tyranny of a terrorist organization known as MASAC, the acronym. I want to keep reiterating this, MASAC, M-A-H, Ming On Line, the former general of the Thamada, no longer a general, no longer in the military, no longer representative of Burma's no-built armed forces. And his state administration council, SAC, better known as the Taliban of Burma, the Khmer Rouge, the Boko Haram, whatever you want to call it, MASAC is notorious today as a satanic cult, mercilessly persecuting the beloved people of Myanmar, 135 different ethnicities, 100 languages, 53 million people, under the tyranny, the assassination, the murder, the torture, the persecution of the people who love and want democracy and freedom. Equal to that, the terrorist group MASAC is continuing. I think it's important for all of us to recognize our brothers and sisters, our artists, 120 so-called celebrities, artists, performers, filmmakers, social media personalities, the range of people who care about the heart, the art. They're either been targeted with arrest warrants and or are in some form of maneuvering throughout the country in so-called hiding. MASAC, the terrorist group, is going specifically after the mind, the heart, the creativity, the influencers, the radical existential creative savants of Myanmar. That's an attack on all of us. And continuing to go into the homes, an unrelenting tyranny to take out doctors and nurses, superintendents of many important places within the country, and dragging them away, beating them, torturing them, and we don't know where they are except they're being thrown into the gulags of Burma. Today is series number 7 in my presentation for my new book, Extinction, X-Rated. It's an auto-fictional, super dark and light satire on good and good old evil. I hope you can get it. It's on Amazon worldwide. I wish it was on other platforms. But there it is. 7 months in isolation in the very room that I'm speaking today. I'm proud of it. It's radical. If you are light in heart, don't even think twice about it. But it's my artistic Sermon on the Mount. Today, again, indoctrination. The deliberate manipulation, if you will, of cognitive, psychological, emotional functions to then enslave the mind, you or me or someone we know, enslave the mind to do things that are contrary to one's own values and principles. Kill in the name of freedom, persecute in the name of democracy, torture in the name of liberty, perversity, satanic terrorism, the manipulation of the human mind. We see it all over the world. We've all been victims of it. And for those rare girls and boys in the world who practice Satipatthana Vipassana meditation, who have the good virtue to have been blessed to be in the life of a Kalyanamitta, a radical woman or a man who is committed to non-collusion with you, non-complicity with you. One of the greatest gifts to have in this world is an ally of the heart. a man or a woman, a nun or a monk, doesn't matter at this point. Someone radically committed to mindful intelligence, radical curiosity, deep wonderment, the elevation of freedom. Today's talk, freedom, 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 freedom. We can't talk enough about it. We can't live it enough. Free to breathe oxygen that's pure. We must do it on our own repeatedly. Freedom is an act that we must make conscious choices of, to state the obvious, over and over and over again at that primordial crossroad that we all live moment to moment. Every page of a book, every text, every letter that we press down on our phone is a conscious choice, or a programmed choice, or a numb choice, or a habit choice, or an enslaved choice, or whatever it may be. So the difference between addiction and freedom. Okay. Back in the day, I remember reading a story about one of those interesting psychological studies. I think it's called the Dr. Fox effect, in a nutshell. A fictitious university, I think it's called Albert Einstein Center for Research, a group of scientists got together. They wanted to understand the role of conscious presentation and the ability of individuals or a group to determine the value, the efficacy, the truth, and the wisdom in what's being shared. Communication and the evaluation of communication based upon principles and truth. And so they hired, at the time, I think it was in 1970 here in California, they hired a very renowned TV actor. And I think his name was something Fox, and therefore the Dr. Fox effect. And they gave him the artificial label of a PhD, Dr. Fox. And his special talent was mathematical game theory and physician's education. That was the theme of a talk that he was to give for 20 minutes to, the point here is, to a group of psychiatrists, psychologists with doctorates, and PhD students, a highly intelligent, super, uber refined group of men and women who would evaluate Dr. Fox's 20-minute presentation on game theory and its role in physicians' education. Now, Dr. Fox was told to say things in his 20-minute talk that made no sense. How do you do that? Use and employ charisma, non sequiturs, neologisms, things that only mean something to you. I am that. The truth of this is this. I mean, let's just get into some details. What's the pixelation of that? So he was trained in charisma, in mannerism, tonality, timing, space, word choice, but his intention was to make absolutely zero sense to the meaning of the meaningless topic he was presenting, game theory and its efficacy to physicians' education, to, again, 55 PhDs, psychiatrists, and doctorate students. And he gave the 20-minute talk, and he waxed and waned and used all of his charm and all the various deliberate vocabulary and etymological tools to make no sense. And to the shock of the researchers, in a written evaluation of the prestigious Dr. Fox, the ultimate savant, if you will, of game theory and its application to physicians' education, they gave him stellar reviews. But in reality, he made no sense whatsoever. Shocking, correct? The researchers, according to the research that I've looked into online, you can look for yourself, they did it again, and they asked him to do it again in some identical form, but absolutely be certain not to make any sense whatsoever. And this time around, with a new group of 55 psychiatrists and psychologists and PhD students, really the illustrious set at the Albert Einstein Research Center. This time he even got more stellar reviews, to the point where some of the leading psychiatrists said they wanted to go back to school, back into training, to get another doctorate in this very specialized field that would help them understand the human psyche, human psychology, and the role of freedom in cognitive processes. And yet there was nothing in it that made sense. We talk about freedom. We talk about indoctrination. It happens to idiots and fools, but no. Social engineering, psychological engineering, religious engineering, the manufacturing, to use a phrase of Professor Noam Chomsky, the manufacturing of a consent that makes no sense. The most satanic or evil expression of that often is in the indoctrination of a soldier or a terrorist who kills in the name of an ideology. Allah, Buddha, Shiva, my Jesus. It doesn't matter. My democracy, my fascism, my totalitarianism, my communism, my radical leftism, if it's identified with, as the Buddha talked about in the text that I've read attributed to the teachings of the Buddha, if there is this thing called lobha, moha, and dosa, greed, anger, and delusion, that congeals the etymological thought process, the next thing you know, your thought is influenced deeply by delusion and wrong view and anger. And if you have the filter of projection and blame, and all of a sudden you feel threatened, you go into war consciousness, violence consciousness. Welcome to planet Earth, right? How many wars have been waged in the name of a delusion? A lie, a conscious lie, a deliberate lie, an ideological lie. The earth is filled with the blood and the tears, to state the obvious, although they're hard to see under the grass, under the concrete, under the urban buildings. The land is filled with tears and blood and sinews and organs of people massacred, obliterated based upon the delusion of an indoctrination that vilifies and makes wrong, justifiably so, enough to do what's happening in the Burma today with the terrorist group, to persecute, terrorize, kill, assassinate, rape, torture, and imprison an entire population that refuses to be imprisoned and tortured. They are fighting back with human consciousness. We're saying no to indoctrination. We're saying no to terrorism. Welcome to the epic battle of good and evil. Today, indoctrination part 2. Another point I want to make is freedom is not an easy thing just to, riff on and just talk about the beauty of intimacy and tantra and just, radically authenticate the truth of your own innate being and dance to the liberty of your own unique music, whatever those things are that just, resonate with the most beautiful places of poetry and romance in our being. Let's make love in a unique, liberating way. Okay, fine. But how do you know that's not just programmed tantra, communistic tantra, habitual, porn-based tantra indoctrination? I mean, to really own your own mind. Pause. When I met one of my Kalyanamitas after Mahasi Sayadaw passed away in Burma, the Venerable Sayadaw U Pandita, a classic phrase, I cannot ever emphasize the importance of this one phrase that he shared with me. Alan, the most important thing that a human being can do in her or his life is to know their own mind. There's something so pure about the Dhamma of knowing one's own mind, the vocation. Isn't that Dhamma? Isn't that religion? Isn't that the fidelity of the holy? Isn't that mindful intelligence inhabiting the recesses, the ecosystem, the biological, spiritual, psychological, existential ecosystem of shared space? Isn't that what we're doing? To know the mind, not only one's own mind, but to know consciousness in context through the senses. That's the beauty I can see in my own humble investigation of the Pali word Dhamma, or the Sanskrit word Dharma. It's not religious, it's not Buddhist, it's not Hindu, it's not Christian. It's so holy, though, because it speaks to the intelligence inherent in interbeing, to use a Thich Nhat Hanh phrase, of how to inhabit shared space consciously, to de-indoctrinize, de-enthrall the human psyche and the source of consciousness, de-enthrall it from deluded, hypnotic, indoctrinated behaviors and beliefs and states of consciousness. You become unprogrammed from lies, thus the radiance of truth. Freedom, the radiance of a mind who wants to know her or his own consciousness, to know one's own mind. One of my best friends, who was a monk together in the Mahasi Tatanayekta in Rangoon, from Los Angeles. He passed away some years back. Just a beautiful mind. All of our friends are just beautiful minds, but he was really a beautiful mind for me, and I miss him. Tom, and he was diagnosed early on in his life with early onset Alzheimer's. And it's amazing to me, a man who was a very renowned meditator, a DJ, a professor of English at Kyoto University, had his own radio talk show, cognitively declined. I mean, he studied freedom through the psychedelic metaphor, through life, through adventure, through mindfulness, through renunciation. He had a fair feel for the radiance of Vimmuti and jnana, insight, and panya, wisdom, the ability to inhabit, co-inhabit nama rupa, or consciousness and physicality and context, with a degree of freedom. The freedom from the kilesa, the freedom from fear. Not altogether freedom, not uprooting these uprooting these kilesas, but a modicum of balanced, wise, insightful, mindfully intelligent, applied presence to the phenomena of the eye seeing form and color, the ear hearing sound, the mind thinking, seeing images, physical sensations in the body, not indoctrinated through the habitual reactions of fear and judgment and blame and loneliness and sadness and all the various things that are so human. But what is freedom? The freedom from, the freedom to engage, and the pure adventure of freedom to explore. I'm going to get into that. But Tom, I was with him, both in person and digitally, on Skype, in FaceTime, over the 3, 4, or 5 years. It happened very quickly, from diagnoses to death. And what we take so for granted is this, take so for granted consciousness, this invisible apparatus of discernible elements. At least it seems like it's somewhat discernible, although there is this thing called the subconscious and the subconscious that resides analogously like that which is beneath the ocean. And there's just a small little island tip with this sand beaches or rocks and various foliage and growth, and there's a mountain. And it seems like this is where we live our lives, on the paths, walking along the cliff face, driving our cars and shopping at Whole Foods and having love and making out and buying and living on this little Hawaiian island, this Balinese island, yet beneath the water is this whole other world that sits on top of a sphere, that sits on the subconscious of a galaxy. and the infinite dimensions of the deeper subconscious within the totality of samsara. And it's like, my God, what is freedom in relativity? And all of a sudden you get diagnosed with dementia, or in my friend's case, early onset Alzheimer's, and your cognitive capacity, what seems to be the control of the functions of psychology and conditioning and memory, begin to, I want to use the word deteriorate, but I'm not sure that's an appropriate word. They begin to change. They begin to be more anicca and more anatta. It's like, I don't have control over my mind the way I did. How many times Tom would tell me that? Anatta vata sankhara. And we remind each other, what an insight into the emptiness of the phenomenology of consciousness and identity. We take so for granted that everything is happening to me, or you, or I, or other, other. And yet there's no fixation in there. We go like, oh wow, what an insight. And he would just rip with pity or joy as the mind deteriorated from a conventional medical point of view, his capacity to remember. The shoreline of his own identity began to fade. And as it did, though, miraculously, he began to remember interviews in the monastery that he had long forgotten. Even go back to some of his books that he would find, and he remembered what he had written. But when he was in the normal waking state, pre-Alzheimer's, conditioned through although there was a lot of freedom there, a lot of beauty, a lot of music, a lot of dance, a lot of love, he was married, he was happy, but conventionally speaking, oh my God, he's gotten the dreaded Alzheimer's at an early age, and so he's going to forget everything, he's going to deteriorate, he is going to lose his mind. His biggest fear that he found, and he told me this, is that people, every time that they hear that I've been diagnosed with the AZ, they think I'm going to die soon and I'm losing my mind. That is the innate projection that he heard constantly when people related to him. It was really a kind of tragic, kind of culturally conditioned curse to see someone as in that way. Anyway, I found it remarkable to be up close. What a gift it was for me to be in close to him in the process of his transition from so-called cultural Dharma-based normalcy into the deterioration where he no longer even knew his daughter or his wife's name. And then, in a way, his anatta took over, and his innate conditioning based upon his unique constellation of karma, and I don't know how to even describe the infinite ecosystem of his own interrelated existences, whatever that collective intelligence is that informs here up the top of the island tip of being. And we're talking about indoctrination here in freedom. You then have to just live based on the habit condition of the phenomenology of mind and matter in context. And it was scary to not make haste, to know your mind, agachara, as U Pandita would call me, to know your mind, the most important task of your life. That sanvega, that urgency, that dhamma, velocity to want to prioritize the overcoming of indoctrination, programming, habitual behaviors in speech, the habit patterns of judgment and denigration, all that we're looking at around the world, I think. Not only, I know it's easy to say that, but when we see someone acting out, like we see in Burma today with the terrorist group Masak, they are welded to the hypnosis of their kilesa. In a nutshell, that's the psychological evaluation by any monk or nun who could see them. They are welded to the psychological configuration of their own unique sculpting through time immemorial, infinite lifetimes that give rise to the unique configuration of context and karma and the result of karma or vipaka, and all of a sudden you find this organic sculpting of inner being made manifest, and you're acting out through the terrorizing of a population. The hypnosis, the indoctrination, the fusion of identity with kilesa, and with the power and the conviction in the rightness of your kilesa, the real evilization of ignorance, the Hitler-esque evilization of greed. So, freedom. A couple of dimensions that I found important to go deeper into the issue of freedom. This is how I learned it from my teachers in Burma. The late Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw, Sayadaw U Zawana, Sayadaw U Sujata, and Sayadaw U Janaka, and Sayadaw U Pandita. Those 5 monks were my principal Kalyanamittas. They've all passed away except Sayadaw U Janaka, whom I saw when I was in Rangoon a year ago to pay my respects to him. I think he was 91. I have been blessed as an outsider to Myanmar to find my way like a moth to the primordial light of a hoped-for nibbana. I was blessed to make that long trek with my partner at the time across Asia, to India, to Burma, and to meet the Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw, to ask him I would like to ordain as a monk. I was blessed. But here, as I proceed, how I was taught and as I remember it, Mahasi Sayadaw said there are 2 main dimensions to practice freedom. And again, I use the word freedom as to know your mind. The Dhamma is to practice the freedom of consciousness. That's what I see, for me personally, the meaning of bhavana. Mind training to liberate mind from greed, anger, and delusion. I see nothing more important to one's well-being and the well-being in community and family and society and the planet than individuals who, she and he, take radical responsibility for learning the ancient Dhamma art of how to responsibly engage the phenomena of contraction and denigration, self-generated suffering and conflict, and when identified with, we act out through the senses and the body and the hands, and we can see history throughout time. Wars, genocides, rapes. Everything gets done based upon either the wisdom of consciousness or the ignorance of consciousness. And then we have this, who knows, the existential karma effect of why this universe is even in place. But here we are as entities within it, molecules of mind and matter, inhabiting form and consciousness, trying to psychologically, spiritually, philosophically, socially, politically, culturally, existentially, numismatically, in the dimension of the infinite, the inexplicable, the ineffable, trying to understand the mind, our own relationship to consciousness in context. Mahasi Sayadaw said there are 2 dimensions to practice freedom. 6 senses focused on one's own mind and body. Classic meditation. Employing the timeless quality of mindful intelligence with the appropriate amount of effort and poise and patience and focus. And we begin to immediately sanctify more intimately the moments of our lives by being more attentive to watching and feeling and knowing the machinations of consciousness arising within consciousness and the sensations inherent in consciousness being embodied. The first form of practice, mindfulness upon mind and body, and inverting the senses to just a sound on the ear, noting hearing, and noting the mind of knowing hearing, and knowing the phenomenology of seeing thoughts, sensations. And secondly, he described the practice of freedom to be consciousness in context, or the practice of what I would call world relationships. To state the obvious, but often very blind and in an indoctrinated delusion about it. The meditative employment of knowing consciousness and developing the practice of freedom from fear, greed, and delusion, by being alive in the world, as if there's any other place to be than in the world. We can't escape the world by choosing to be in a closet or a farm or on a mountaintop. We always carry our mind and body, and we're always in context. And we can't often control the context of what we encounter, but as it's thought and believed and felt and determined, we can try our very best to develop a more conscientious, wise, caring response to the phenomena of the unexpected. We may not be able to control the outer, but we can do our very best to control the inner. That is crucial, to do what we can to control the inner dimensions of inner beingness and sanctify the Dhamma of that process by deliberately developing compassion, loving kindness, patience, determination, and freedom from greed, anger, and delusion. What a rare individual it is on this planet who dedicates her life and his life. That's why I just go sadhu, sadhu, sadhu in the Buddhist words, excellent. When I meet nuns and monks, it doesn't matter what they do, that they have decided to renounce the world and live in it in a very consciously deliberate way, and thereby vocation dedicating their every waking hour to the liberation from fear, greed, and delusion, and the elevation of loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, and freedom. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Two dimensions, two places to practice freedom. Self and self in context. Okay. I also learned from my 5 teachers that we cultivate freedom, mindful freedom, insightful, wise freedom in all postures. What are the 5 postures? Standing, walking, sitting, reclining. And the 5th posture is all those little movements of the body, the mind and body, other than those 4. Other than standing, other than sitting, other than walking, other than lying down. Reaching, turning, reclining, talking. Everything that we do, I am so blessed to be able to recall these basic instructions. The embodiment of the practice of freedom is another way to look at the role of a meditator. Another way to look at the mendicant or the woman or the man who embodies the experience of Dhamma is the application of mindfully insightful presence to feel, hear, think, walk, move, recline, bend, for the purpose of relaxing greed, anger, and delusion, and the thousands of nuances of those three states of mind, and the elevation of their opposites, the cultivation of grace, the cultivation of generosity, the cultivation, the deliberate mindful cultivation of the artistry of the state of mind of love. That's a Dhamma practitioner, a Dharma savant, a meditator in dynamic spiritual existential action, a revolutionary activist dedicated to the evolution of universal human rights and democracy and freedom, is identical to a meditator in democratic activist action. They're deliberately, consciously employing freedom in action to support the freedom of others. This is where we've often heard that freedom comes with responsibility. The freedom to protect the freedom of others supports the freedom of self, family, and community and nation. The reciprocity of freedom. A beautiful consideration that my freedom and your freedom cannot be separated. Herein lies the inherent beauty of determining that my vocation in life, which we're seeing in full radiant expression in Burma, through the civil disobedience movement, the CDM, equally the civilian dialogue movement. They're employing the ancient mindful art of conscious speech to confront the weapon, the denigration of evil through arms, the power of Dhamma conscientious speech, Dhamma conscientious action. And this is more of the template that I personally have learned and employ in my own life as the meaning of my Dhamma practice, my world Dharma expression, a trans-Buddhistic, trans-religious expression of freedom inhabiting my own mind and body, and freedom in context. Here's the next thing, the 5 dimensions, if you will. So we've dealt with 2 contexts. We've dealt with 5 postures. We've talked a bit about the role of indoctrination and the deliberate manufacturing of deluded beliefs in the Dr. Fox effect, of how really remarkably intelligent women and men can be so fundamentally duped by what's known as confirmation bias, the deepest proclivities of what we would call, or I would call, pre-soul or pre-subconscious, these deep arteries, if you will, existential organs of the subconscious that inhabit our own waking mind, and unknowingly we have proclivities and personality traits and tendencies called confirmation bias. Next thing you know, we are believing something and thinking something based upon the unrecognized fusion, indoctrination to a deeper proclivity that's often unmindfully believed. The Dr. Fox effect. Why did intelligent women and men believe things that fundamentally made no sense, except that it resonated? Let me pause here if I can, and thank you for supporting me in just sharing from my own heart here. You know, one of the most famous suttas, and I would recommend that you look it up in the Buddhist texts and really memorize it in your own unique way, called the Rahula Suta. And the Buddha was invited to give a talk to address this village of Kalamas on who to believe. And it was made clear not to believe things simply because it resonates with your own sense of intuitive truth, okay? Hear those words? Because it resonates with your own sense of intuitive truth. The Dr. Fox effect, it resonated with their own sense of intuitive truth. Just because we use poetic or romantic or existentially acceptable cultural words to describe what to trust, it doesn't mean that you automatically need to trust that. We need to understand what is the truth of the experience, not the projection of truth of the experience. The difference between the idea and the taste and the feel versus the ideation. There's no amount of believing that the food I'm about to eat will satisfy the hunger and the nutrient needs of the mind and the body. There's no way to take a bath in one's own mind alone. Probably there is if you do some acid, but there's no way to get into the ocean by thinking about being in the ocean. Yes, you can use your imagination, but for me it's a poor substitute, although yes, you can imagine. But being in the water is a finer way to clean the body than simply thinking about taking a shower, having a bath, or being in love, or being intimate, being awake, and being in forms of liberty. Set aside the Dr. Fox effect, which is in its most evil expression, is, hey man, hey you up at the front of the room, you got it all wrong. Your whole understanding of game theory as it applies to physician education, dude, is wrong. In fact, you are evil. Bang, bang, bang. Welcome to Burma. Welcome to Iraq. Welcome to Syria. Welcome to Libya. Welcome to the history of blood in the name of bang, bang, bang. Democracy is wrong. Freedom is wrong. God is wrong. Allah is wrong. How easy it is to make the person at the front of the room, the back of the room, wrong. How easy it is to make yourself at the front of the room, at the back of the room, wrong. Cultural mirroring distortions. So it's really, really, really radically important to hear this Rahula Suta, simply because it's respected in religious holy books. Don't buy it. Because someone comes with 10,000 likes and swipes an hour, bestseller, Oprah endorsed it, don't buy it as fact. I mean, so rad, so cool to hear someone in a text go, hey man, there's another way to determine the truth of something, and that's based upon you understanding freedom of mind based upon a deliberate, felt relationship to the qualities of consciousness. States of mind, SOM, states of consciousness, SOCs. What does delusion feel like as a state of mind? How do I know delusion from truth? And that's those of you who meditate, who've been in the association with really talented women and men, Kalyanamitas, people who are willing not to collude with you, not to be in complicity with your need for pride and ego and, you know, I'm going to just get my teacher training and go out there and swag this story and I'll have my 10,000 followers. Next thing you know, I'll be an influencer at 1 million and I'll just be making all kinds of loot based upon my, you know, my fraudulent little mindful training that I got here in Santa Monica at $10,000 a minute. There's a lot of that shit that goes down. We know it. I don't want to make fun of it. It's already embarrassing the way it is. Generally, if you have to pay for it, it's not cool. The Rahula Suta, he said, no. Only through your own deep application of the Dhamma, of mindful intelligence, will you understand freedom. And even so, you must do it again and again and again and again. Allow me to pause here. You know, you look at the sutta, I think it's called the Rahula Suta. The Buddha's talking to his son, who's quite young at the time. And it's such an essence teaching, the way I hear it. He's telling his son, what is most important? To use your mind like an organic mirror that sees and feels and knows the phenomena as it really is. When you're thinking, before you think, while you think, after you think, and you reflect mindfully on what you thought. If you know through your own mindful relationship to the phenomenology that what you thought, before you think it, during thinking, after you thought, it was rooted, filtered with greed, anger, and delusion, oh my son, Rahula, refrain from that thought again. How cool is that? And then the same thing, my friend, Rahula, when you're speaking, before you speak, while you speak, after you've spoken, and you reflect mindfully upon the process. Was it co-joined with greed, anger, and delusion. I'm not saying judge yourself, Rahula, but do all that you can to understand the machinations of self-generated conflict that, when identified with, we often project and we influence negatively other people. We create conflict, we create suffering, we create discord through our speech, through our actions, through our thoughts. My friend Rahula, my son, if you mindfully can assess for yourself upon thinking, if you can mindfully assess for yourself upon thinking and speaking that it was not what you wanted it to be, rooted in love, compassion, and wisdom, refrain. The same thing with actions. Before you act, during an action, if you can feel that, interrupt the action. Imagine right now, Masak in Burma, a leading Sayadaw or Tilashin in the country, a nun or a monk, grabbed a hold of his mind and said, "Listen, Masak, you must listen to the teachings of the Buddha coming through me as a leading Sayadaw in the country. I'm going to talk to you about the Kalama Sutta. I'm going to talk to you about the Rahula Suta. And you must become more mindful of what you're doing. You are inhabiting the delusion of hypnosis. You are indoctrinated. You're papanchified. You're deluded. You're moha asphyxiated. You're drowning and suffocating without wisdom. You're in the perversity of a state of mind. Masak, I'm grabbing you by your psychic ears. Hear me. I am Siddhagu Sayadaw in your face. Stop your delusion. Stop your ignorance. Angulimala, stop your greed. What an epic moment to have televised around the world of Siddhagu Sayadaw in Naypyidaw with Masak grabbing him through his Dhamma head and saying, snap out of your perversity, out of your coma, out of your delusion. And I'm going to order Masak, the terrorist group, the Formatamada, to cease the assassination, the terror of our people. Just like that, a state of consciousness. Freedom. Believe only that which liberates the mind from greed, anger, and delusion. What a radical, rooted teaching, coming right back to Sayadaw U Pandita. The most important thing you can do in your life, Agasara, is to know your own mind. Self and other, 5 postures: standing, walking, sitting, lying down, and everything in between, including eating and speaking. And then 5 dimensions: mind in all circumstances, no time off from freedom. All states of mind, no time off from freedom. All postures, no time off from freedom in all postures, at all times, in all circumstances, and in all contexts, and in all degrees of complexity. You can see how this Dhamma is so all-inclusive, and it's so, and I am just a young student of Dhamma, how articulate the study and the practice of freedom is. And so let me come to the last quarter of today's share, and I'll continue tomorrow. Obviously, we're living in dimensionality. And what I mean by that is we're living in social situations, we're living in physiological situations, We're living in cultural situations. We're living in political situations. We're living in spiritual or Dhammic situations. We're living in existential realities. And we're living in, I would call, I don't know what the word is, but in the pre-existential, the whole larger than the verbiage of the existential, the nuministic, the totality, the infrastructure of samsara, all dimensions, all times, all states, all forms, all circumstances, all things that could be known in the physics, in the universe that we understand it. Therein lies our meditative monastic setting. We are alive in all dimensions. And this is the beauty, very rare beauty that I have seen in the world, that I was introduced to the Dhamma of politics, the Dhamma of activism, the Dhamma of reconciliation, the modernization of Dhamma in context to include the struggle for freedom. This is where I became an advocate, a student, and a lover of the trans-monastic yekta setting Dhamma practice of an ordinary / noble yogi, and realizing that the yekta and even being a bhikkhu were such a relative framing. They're just ideas, but we're alive in the world, and that includes democracy. That includes the universality of human rights. That includes the confrontation with dictatorship and tyranny. That includes weapons and delusion. That includes indoctrination and the deliberate engineering of behaviors through social media, through technology, through computers, through phones. We're alive in an intersecting network of physical and mental and emotional and existential realities. The modern yogi, the modern savant, the modern activist, like I see in Burma, that I learned from Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and U Tin U and U Win Tain and U Chi Mung and U Win Tin and so many other hundreds of boys and girls and men and women in Burma who nobly, courageously engaged their beliefs and their conscience and were willing to live imprisoned for their beliefs. They introduced me to the beauty of bringing my Dhamma into the context of politics and democracy. Welcome to the CDM movement in Burma, a trans-religious, deep respect for consciousness and how I inhabit consciousness, how I think and speak and act will influence my behaviors through thought, speech, and action, and, hopefully educate the oppressor. In seeing, in high fidelity, we're choosing the activism of conscience and peace over assassination, torture, and coercion. Isn't that the epic battle of good and evil? That's the Buddha with Angulimala. They're people dedicated to the study of knowing their own mind and putting that into dynamic action. Let me close today with today's installment on Indoctrination, Part 2, the noble fight for freedom. And it's clearly a fight. I am awed and touched and horrified and enamored by the revolutionary spirit of the people of Burma. I can barely read and watch the footage coming out with the Wi-Fi down and the internet down and the terror behind the dark curtain of that level of isolation from the world community, and then the pathetic, there's no other way to talk about it. The pathetic, pathological impotence, bear with me here, I've got to say it again, the pathetic, pathological impotence of the world community. World leaders, across the board, the United Nations, utterly psychotic in their refusal. If Burma isn't a case to put UN anti-terror soldiers on the ground, I don't know what is. And if I were a world leader right now in England or America or in France or in Germany or in Canada or Australia, I would act alone, and I'd put my battleship, my aircraft carrier, I'd put my soldiers on the ground in Rangoon and say, hey, listen, Mossack, guess who you're fighting now? We're separating you. We're saving you from your own evil. And let the world community weep and moan, and you are not honoring the timeless collusion of letting a country kill itself if they need to do that in order to be happy. Well, I don't want to belong to that world. Welcome to the Dhamma in dynamic action, right? Setting these impotent leaders around the world, let them stew in their own pathology, and issue ongoing press releases and how it's just not right what's going down there and you must stop and blah, 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 blah. But the people of Burma and the broader Burmese diverse ethnic people around the world, the funneling of funds into the people of Burma to feed them, to support them, and the world community that is rising up to help these men and women, these boys and girls, as Mossack, the terrorist group, is going into the homes now, more and more, shooting into the homes, taking the comedians, the satirists, the filmmakers, the journalists, the doctors, the nurses, the civil servants, the teachers, the social media influencers, the celebrities, anyone who has the dream of art, heart, and revolutionary voice, incarceration, torture, subjugation, death. Something so wrong there that this is my last point, is that freedom isn't just wow, sweet talk and joy. Freedom for me is rising out of the Dr. Fox indoctrination of the PhD of conformity and go, wow, man, I am a predictable cyborgian psychotherapist, psychiatrist, president, congresswoman. I am a programmed, cyborgian, predictable habit called I'm indoctrinated, man. And these women and men in Burma are like rad. They're showing us what rad looks like in dynamic action. Talk about 3 fingers up and then a double high five on both hands and high in the radiance. You people in Burma rock. To state the obvious, man, you're showing the world of what Dhamma and meditation and mindfulness looks like when you're not tethered to profit, privilege, and conformity and predictable behaviors of yet another teacher training, yet another asana of predictable downward-facing delusion. You've broken the mold, man. You're putting mindfulness and freedom into dynamic action. So my point here is the convulsion of freedom. I know it's not an original thing to say that, but, throw down the script, You don't need to have your Netflix special be memorized. Whatever happened to the wisdom of improvisational naturalness, uncensored liberty to speak your Fucking mind and heart up close to the Satan of delusion and snap, Mr. Sidigu Sayadaw, Satan himself in Naypyidaw. Go up to Naypyidaw in your private helicopter and get out and talk to the devil in his face. Shake him by his demonic ears. Snap out of your coma, Dr. Foxian, PhD in dictatorship. It ain't working. And I'm here to tell you how to liberate your mind from the coma, the active coma of delusion. One person, do your Gandhi. Do it. End the tyranny. So the convulsion of freedom is radical, innovative, creative. I don't want perfect prose. I don't want perfect tantra. I don't want predictable behaviors with the right pronoun alone. I don't want to just be politically, spiritually, mindfully correct and belong to the cult of white upper echelon, mindful, spiritual privilege. I am now in the straitjacket of conformity. I'm a really good, dead, frozen, paralyzed West Coast Buddhist teacher. No offense. Living in the hypocrisy of everything that you lie about. So we need to convulse. We need to break out. The moment today, America and the world, cancellation, we're canceling the cancel culture because no one's given us more fire to rise up, to stand up, to speak up, to dance in the liberty of our own unique expression of overcoming greed, anger, and delusion, and integrate freedom in social, cultural, political, democratic, all spheres imaginable. The new world dharma, I would call it. No dimension, no posture, no time, no circumstance that our Dhamma, our mindfulness, our meditation, our trans religion can't include, and that too. Break free. Break free in the poetry, like the girls and boys, the nuns and monks, the doctors, the medics, the teachers, the civil servants, the comedians, the bankers in Burma. Refuse to participate in evil, and let us throw funds, millions and trillions of dollars in psychic support and medical supplies. Bring in your troops, England. Bring in your troops, Canada. Bring in your troops, Australia. Put them on the ground. Show up. Let's see a different world, right? Confront China. Confront Russia. Tell them we're interfering because freedom is something you support. You don't collude with evil and denigration of it. Let's convulse and break the old order and rise to the new order. So from my heart to yours, thank you for giving me a chance to rant about something important. I hope you'll share this video. I hope you will acquire my book, Extinction X-Rated. It's just 8 hours of what you just heard. And it will rock you. It will disturb you. You'll want to scream. But if you don't come through that wanting to basically liberate yourself and be true to who you really are and break the coma of your story, break out of the narrative of culture and conditioning, own who you are and live in the radiance of that, rebirth after rebirth, and to support the freedom of others, well, if you fear that, don't get it. Otherwise, if you're looking for some really high-octane support existentially to be true to yourself, get it. Extinction X-Rated. I'll continue tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you from my heart, and have a great day. And let us not only not forget the people of Burma, the good girls and boys over there fighting hard. Let's do everything we can to join them in their revolution of the spirit. And let's not forget Aung San Suu Kyi, and they want to put her away permanently in prison along with the president, Win Myint, and my friend U Win Tain, and Sean Turnell of Australia, and hundreds of other people. Let's refuse to let them do that. Rock on, Burma.